Hey there, Banditos. It's Wednesday, so that must mean there's a new episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits coming right at you. We hope everyone had a lovely, lovely Easter, Passover, spring break, whatever it is. But let's, cut to the chit chat here, guys. Let's get the intros out of the way. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And as always, we're bringing you another fantastic interview. And today, it's only Orrin.
Oh, yes.
It's an only Orrin episode, guys. They don't happen often, right? Crazy.
Very rare.
Very rare. But in all seriousness, it's a really interesting episode. It's Orrin's interview with none other than Bob Hall. You may know Bob from his career at DC, Marvel, and Valiant. And he had a really long run on Shadowman at Valiant. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's where I remember Bob the most. He talks about his start at Valiant and, working on Shadowman and, a lot of the ins and outs of what goes on with a book like that. And it was just really fascinating to be able to sit down and talk to him. I've been, looking forward to it for such a long time.
Yeah, this sounds like a really good one, really great one. Been looking forward to hearing from Bob Hall for a while. He is also, besides Shadowman, which I also do remember him from and love that series, one of the co-creators of the West Coast Avengers when they decided to, follow the gold, go out west, prospect a little bit, and, avenge. So it was great hearing Orrin's interview with Bob Hall. So let's get to it so you can listen to it too. This is Bob Hall.
First question we ask all our guests is, how did you discover comics?
My first real discovery, I think my dad had bought me some, like Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse and stuff. But when I was about 4 years old and before I could read, I couldn't read well at all. And I was very ill. Nobody knew what was wrong. I was vomiting blood. And so my folks took me to the hospital. The story gets better as it goes, don't worry. And obviously I didn't die. And but they just couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. And the next day, I was still in the hospital, but I felt very good. Right? But they said, no, you're still sick. And from they did tests and stuff, and I was still sick. And but I was so active and 4 years old, I was jumping around in the bed and stuff like that. And they brought me various toys to pacify me. But then they started bringing me comic books. And I was in this private room, thank God. And the comic books just kept piling up. But they still didn't know what was wrong. So on about the third day, they were going to run some more tests. And they were wheeling me out, and the nurse saw me scratching behind my ear and looked behind my ear and said, "Oh my God, you have measles." And it turned out I had intestinal measles. They didn't come out. They were inside. And the doctor came in and looked and said, "Well, you got them. And at this point, you're going to be fine. And by the way, all those comics are contaminated and you have to take them all home." So I went home with this shopping bag full of comic books that for a 4-year-old included everything from Donald Duck to EC Comics. And that got me started.
Wow. Now, did you keep any of those comics, or have they all?
No.
Oh.
No, those. And then once I got started reading comics, I found a Salvation Army store in town that was selling comics from the 40s for 2 cents a piece. And those are the ones that I really am pissed off that my mom threw away. But, she threw them all away.
Yeah, it's a similar story that goes on.
It's the story of the world. Yeah.
It's a rite of passage for comic fans.
Yeah.
Now, you started your career and you worked, I'm actually reading a book about the place right now. You worked at Charlton for a little while.
Very briefly, but for maybe 6 months or so.
Okay.
Or maybe closer to a year, I guess.
Okay.
But I didn't do that much. I did, I think, 2 or 3 stories and several covers. And so I had gotten started, and I'd portfolios to everybody, but Charlton was the starting place at that time. And I can't really remember offhand the name of even the comics. It was Dr. Somebody's House of Chills or Thrills, or one of those. And it was a silly story about it, but it was set in the Renaissance, and I liked that. That was fun because I'd done a lot of theater work, and I could do that kind of stuff. I knew costume design and period, what periods looked like. But then John Buscema started teaching his class on how to draw comics. That was the basis for how to draw comics the Marvel way. And there was an ad in the back of Marvel Comics saying, you know, if you live in the New York area, you can sign up for it. You have to bring a portfolio to John, and in a hotel. I don't even remember which hotel anymore. It doesn't exist anymore, and I can't remember which one. But so I, with great trepidation, I gave, for showing my portfolio to John Buscema, and being Johnny just said, "Yeah, you're in." And so I took the class, and it turned out I was a little bit older and probably the most experienced person in the class. I don't know if I was the most talented, but I had done a bunch of stuff. I put myself through college doing posters for the theater department and program covers, and so I just had some background, and the scenery design and costume background helped a lot too. And at the end of the class, John got me a job at Marvel, and that's how I got into it.
I was going to say, it seems like the theater background really helped you, like you said, with design and costume, which is so much a part of comics.
Well, the big thing was that was true, but the big thing, because what I wanted to do is be a director, and in fact have been a director all my life. I've kept doing it. I'm still a member of the union, and I've directed probably about 200 plays. Mm-hmm. But the structure of plays and the structure of comics are similar. So it was also the storytelling. And when I first started at Marvel, I think I was, my draftsmanship was not the greatest, I didn't think. At least I didn't think. People now bring me the comics, and I don't, I'm almost afraid to look at them, but I don't say so because people treasure them. So who am I to say? But the storytelling, I think, is what got me through. I was very good at that.
Now, if you had, just a moment. Sorry, my phone was ringing. If you could go back, would you have seen yourself full-time in theater? Could that have been a career for you, or was comics always a draw to pull you back in some way?
No, yeah, comics all pulled me back. I was not the right fit for New York, although I was there for 25 years, and I was not the right fit for New York in theater. And I quickly realized that there are various things you can do to maintain it. Now, I had a lot of jobs, and I had a lot of fun, but that for a career in the theater, it really helps to have gone to Yale, NYU, Juilliard. And I didn't know that. I'm from Nebraska. What do I know? And so I went to New York without any real network of people I could go to who were working. I knew a lot of people like me who were trying to break in. And I basically feel I tried to break into the theater for 25 years in spite of getting work, because I was in that situation where each time I did a job, it did not necessarily lead to another job, no matter how good it may or may not have been. It was that required somehow getting yourself. I felt like the theater was. I spent a lot of time with my nose pressed to the glass, watching people eat expensive meals or something, metaphorically. And with comics, the thing with being a director in New York is you don't have anything to show anybody unless you can get them to come see something you've done. Especially back then, when it was almost impossible to show somebody a video. I mean, there's nothing to it now, but you really had nothing to show them. And there was a great relief of comics that you were bringing something that wasn't just you, and you could say, here's what I do. and that fit me a lot better than in terms of getting work than the theater did.
Gotcha.
I love the theater and still do it. And when comics, imploded in the around the year 2000 for a while, nobody was getting work, and I had a chance to start a Shakespeare festival in my hometown, and did that for 15 years. So
It's pretty
so I
nice.
still, yeah.
Now, as a young man, and you get to Marvel, and it was sort of the ideas factory back then, so much talent coming in. You were part of the young wave of talent coming in. What was that experience like, walking in and being around all these incredible people?
Oh, it was terrifying. Because I think there were people like John Byrne who somehow sprang full blown into Marvel and could, easily make deadlines and do the whole thing. I think the first thing I found out was that if I went slow enough to do it well, I would never get it done. and trying to balance that, I felt I was very slow and that I was going to get fired immediately. And it wasn't until later, when I was an editor, that I realized that just about everybody who started, maybe with the exception of John Byrne, in my generation, felt that way. That you were, oh my gosh, here's all these people around, like, who can do this stuff in, the Buscema's, but in the office were people like Frank Giacoia and things who were, that for them this was, they had learned that this was at that time a by the pound job. You got paid for how much you could produce back then, and not for necessarily how people preferred it to be good, but if they had a choice between done and good, they preferred done. And getting into that was discovering that and trying to fulfill it was hard. So for a while I was a little nervous, and but it worked out.
Did anyone take you under their wing? Was there a learning tree that you were under that helped you through?
Nah. I think the only person that really my writer was Bill Matlow, and I'm very grateful. Matlow did take time to tell me what he thought I was doing wrong or right. You could always go and talk to John Romita, but again, John Romita's, you've got these people, they're legends like John Romita, and you're very hesitant to go in and admit your failings. You were just waiting for him to tell you that isn't any good, but you were hopeful. At least that was my sense. And the person I was most dealt with in terms of deadlines and stuff was John Verpoorten, who was a lovely guy, but very, very quickly died. So I can't remember who I was working with after that. Well, very shortly after that, when I first came into Marvel, Archie Goodwin was the editor, and Archie was a love to work with. I can't say that, again, I look back and say, why didn't you just go into Archie's office and stay there and make him teach you how to do comics? Because there's certainly nobody, never been a better writer than Archie, and a kinder person. But I think when Jim Shooter took over, he had no hesitation about telling you what he thought was right or wrong. And, people complained about that sometimes, but he was the boss, and you were doing, he did teach you a way to do the work. And then he was very helpful.
Now, one of the series you worked on was The Champions. Did you ask to be on that book, or was that presented to you as an assignment?
I would never have asked to be on that. Not because it was a bad book, but because it was my first book. And why on earth they gave me, now part of the whole thing about making deadlines was it was a group book. And why in hell they gave me a group book as my first book Well, I think I know why. I think it's because I had taken the class from John Buscema, who could do group books in his sleep, and they assumed therefore that I could as well. But I was really very relieved when, after I think it was, oh, I don't know, 3 or 4 issues, I was taken off the book and put on Supervillain Team Up, which was a much more manageable book for me. And I think my work started looking better, et cetera, you know, when as soon as I was dealing with 3 people instead of a whole bunch of people running around beating on each other, you know.
Well, both books had heavy hitters character-wise. Did you have to do research, or was there were you asked to follow the art of previous artists who worked on these characters, or were you
Yes.
allowed to do, oh, okay.
Yeah, especially as a first-time artist, you were asked to replicate. And one of the things that Romita did was had a fixation on the look of the characters, so that does anybody remember that Captain America once had a dimple in his chin? But with John, you had to put that dimple in the chin, and for years Spider-Man had to have the webbing under his arms, which I think everybody hated, and I don't know why only oh, what's his name, the first artist,
Ditko.
Ditko.
Yeah.
I think only Ditko could really make that work somehow. Curse you, Steve, for putting that stuff in there. But no, it was the one that got me was Ghost Rider, because Ghost Rider was the heavy hitter in the Champions, and the other Champions were all B-list people. The 2 X-Men have become more popular, the Iceman and the Angel, but they were at that time in a remnants of a failed series, and Black Widow didn't have her own book. Hercules didn't have his own book. There was somebody named Dark Star who was an invention just for that. Why can I remember Dark Star and I couldn't retrieve Steve Ditko's name? But anyway, it's because I'm being recorded. That's why. So all of those were all B-list people except Ghost Rider, and Ghost Rider was the last character that should ever be in a group. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. But he was in the group, and he had to be on his motorcycle whenever he was Ghost Rider, even if this meant that he was Ghost Rider in I think the first issue that I did, in an office that was on fire, and Ghost Rider had to be in the office on his bike. Yeah. And what's worse, no, you just did the wrong motion, because it was that lousy sort of Italian hyphen Japanese ghost, the skull cycle, rather than getting to draw. You didn't even get to draw the chopper, you know. So and that was tough. And I also had a terrible time drawing motorcycles. I'm not a motorcycle person, and I had, although John certainly taught us start with the shapes and work your way up. That's something you have to get into your head and into your everything you do, and most people inevitably start with the outer detail first when you have something difficult, and you learn not to do that. But doing a motorcycle, it was like, how the hell do I draw this thing? And I went out and bought little motorcycles and you know, all this stuff. That was so I was glad when that one was over.
Makes sense. But when did you feel as an artist confident in your abilities and confident that you belonged in the industry?
Not for a long time. It was early 80s. It was when I did the West Coast Avengers. Okay. And I had done a lot of work before then, and some of it I thought was not bad. But the West Coast was the first series that I did. I did some individual issues that I could take a little bit more time with. I think the What If Conan were trapped in the 20th century, that I'd had enough time to ink it myself. One of the things you find too is that you'll pencil something and they're puzzled why the inker doesn't ink it the way you thought it would turn out. Usually this is because you're doing a pencil drawing and you think you're doing it just exactly the way the inker can't help but interpret it correctly. But ink and pencil are two different things. And you have to learn to pencil as if you were inking rather than as if you were doing a pencil drawing. Although some people do beautiful pencil drawings and that are very, very inkable, but somehow it sort of came together for me on West Coast. And I had Brett Breeding, who was quite a good inker and very compatible with what I do. And yeah, that was the first time I think I really, really felt this is good. I did the Avengers and did a decent job on it, but it was it wasn't my best work. We'll put it that way. The Ghost Rider was in it again. Every time I'm running into Ghost Rider.
Well, I want to jump back to Avengers in a minute, but something that you just brought up is the relationship between penciler and inker. Professionally, because we speak to a number of people, and as fans, we always thought that the inker and the penciler would almost be sitting next to each other and giving notes back and forth. But it seems like it's one of those things where sometimes you would just FedEx it to someone, they'd ink it, and it'd be sent, and that there's really no other communication between the two.
Hey, the great thing about Comic Cons is you actually get to meet some of the people you worked with 40 years ago. Yeah, no, we were. Well, Stan created the myth of the bullpen, and that somehow we were. Now, if you thought about it, you knew we were not all working in the same place, but he created that feel, and that was an important feel for Marvel. But no, we usually. You did not communicate much with the inker at all. And what you hoped for was finding the right inker who then you could continue to work with and work with somebody who was compatible with what you did. But the process was such, the nature of the process kept you from having a lot of communication, because what you usually did was working in increments, in my case, usually about 3 or 4 pages. You turned those in, they would then go to be lettered. Well, it was complex. It would be, the pencils would be edited, and if they looked okay, they would be sent back to the writer, who would then write the dialogue based on what he was seeing. And I'm saying he and mean it, because there were very few women writers back then. And once he had written the dialogue, then it would go to the letterer, and then it would go to the inker, who would ink it. By that time, you were hopefully had another 3 or 4 pages done. So it wasn't like the process of you're sitting side by side and I'm finishing a page and saying, here it is. That was pretty much the standard way of doing it back then.
I know you just mentioned Avengers, and you said it wasn't your favorite work. But the fact that you are part of Avengers history, that you did a number of these books, does that still excite you a bit, that you were part of the whole Avengers line?
It excited me when they invited me to a premiere of one of the Avengers movies.
Nice.
I was excited to be doing the Avengers, and it was. I did some work that wasn't bad, but I can look at it and say, I could have done better. But then I look at most of my work and think I could have done better. So Jim really loved to have you pull the camera way back and show where everybody was. He felt that was very important, and I believe that. I still feel that that's an important thing to make comics readable, but that you don't have to do it quite as much as maybe I did it in the Avengers. I look back now and I see a lot of really long shots with lots of people running around, lots of little guys running around in it. And so there was that aspect of it. And it was another group book, and it was my chance to do a group book plus the, when I first got into comics, I hadn't read comics for a long, long time. And somebody suggested that I look at comics as a way of making a living. And because I'm from that generation where you pretty much stopped reading comics when you were 12 or 13 and got interested in girls or whatever. And a friend of mine suggested, and it's one of that I take a look. And the first, and I thought, that bag of comics that I had back when I was sick, a lot of those comics in those days, some were wonderfully drawn, and you knew it immediately, and some were really kind of almost pathetically bad on some of the lower range things, of course, which are very collectible today. And if but I thought, gee, I can be mediocre. I could probably go get that far. And then he gave me this stack of comics to look at, and it was like, I think the one that I was most taken with was Barry Windsor Smith's Conan. But Bernie was in his heyday. Wrightson and John Buscema was, doing a lot of Marvel stuff. Jack had just gone to DC to do the New Gods, but you could also find still on, if you looked through the newsstands, you could find it clear at the back, ones they hadn't returned yet. There was still Jack stuff from Marvel, and but one that just knocked me on my butt was Neil Adams doing the Avengers and the Skrull Kree war stuff. And so I felt, and then I was looking at older Avengers and realized that John and Tom Palmer was doing them before that, and that there was a lot to live up to. So I think I was kind of nervous about doing the Avengers the first time around, saying, can I fill those shoes? So my fans will have to decide. It is, of course, the single most iconic thing that I did in comics was the famous wife-beating, divorce, slap, Wasp, and Yellow Jacket issue. And that was part of that run on the Avengers. And, it's interesting to me. I didn't think about it at the time, but it's really become the thing I'm asked about the most, and that still people bring up. And so, yeah, hey, we did something pretty iconic. And I think it was Jim's doing, really, just that he decided, comics should begin to portray marriages perhaps the way they really were, and that not all of them were, remained wonderful things forever. And it's one of the times when comics grew up a little bit.
When you saw those panels and presented with that story, did you guys hold your breath a little bit when that comic was released as to what's the reaction going to be? Or were you confident that it was handled in such a way that people understand, that this is just part of a story?
Well, I think from having had the career in the theater, I thought nothing about it. It didn't, and that may be why I really had him Walloper, which Jim still claims that isn't what he wanted. Mm-hmm. And that's fun. Jim and I are good friends, and we get together, and we never talk about it anymore. but which I think is entirely possible. But I thought, when you started at Marvel, Stan, it was back in the day when there was a mandatory. It had become almost mandatory at that point that Stan would invite you into his office and stand on his desk and act out how much more dynamic a Marvel comic as opposed to a DC comic you know, and so I think I know I did spent a late night trying to draw that various ways, and finally decided, they're superheroes, you know, it should be big.
Yeah.
And I think Jim was heading toward making certain things in comics a little bit more covert and realistic, but we didn't talk about it. It came out the way it came out.
Yeah, I think it came out just fine.
Yeah.
Avengers West Coast. Were you part of the original team that thought of the idea, or were you brought on as just to help out with the story?
I'm the co-creator of the West Coast Avengers, which means that after Roger pitched it and wrote the first issue, they somehow decided that I would be the person to ask to draw it, maybe after asking 3 other people. So I have no idea. I really don't. The whole co-creator thing is kind of weird to me, because there are a lot of things that, like the West Coast Avengers, that people are co-creators of, that really it became a job of work. You know, you were sent it and you did your best work on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we hardly even ever talked about it. Wow. I think I was just sent the script, and it seemed very clear to me. I think one thing that I did have was a pretty good handle on characters by that time. So, you know, I tried to give, and given the Marvel method that you were given a scenario, you had a lot of freedom to say, well, how does Tigra sit? How is that different from the way Mockingbird sits? And you know, things like that. And I think that turned out pretty well.
Most definitely. You also worked on another team book that I'm hoping, and I see more and more people discovering it, and that's Squadron Supreme, which I thought was a wonderful series. I know it was kind of outside the normal Marvel universe. I mean, there were some ties into it, but how did you get involved in Squadron Supreme, and what's your thoughts on the lasting legacy of the series?
My guess is that I was the second or third person they decided.
There you go.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that I was. I never know why I never know, had any idea why I was picked with stuff, except for occasionally when I worked with Jim. And I know Jim liked the idea that I was in the theater and had written plays, and that maybe I brought something from outside comics into the mix. I hope so. Maybe that's, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had recommended me to Squadron Supreme for that reason, that it was outside the standard stream of Marvel, and that I would get that. So I don't know exactly why, but I suspect that had something to do with it. I had been, before I did that, in the late 70s, I'd been an editor briefly at Marvel, and I know that was the reason Jim wanted me to be an editor, was that, again, to bring another perspective to things. And so I suspect that's what it had to do with it. So yes, it was a great fun series to do, because the characters were not given in the way some of the Marvel characters were. No matter how you cut it, all of the ongoing characters with Marvel are trademarks, and they have, and that's not bad. That's just what they are, you know. So you love Captain America, but Captain America is pretty much Captain America, no matter how much people will try to say, oh my God, now I'm writing Captain America, what am I going to do? I've got to do something different with him. But the fact is that Captain America, or Superman, or whomever that fits in that category, is probably a strong enough character to be resistant to the aims of writers to make him into something other than what he has been. He keeps being snapped back to being Captain America. And it was nice to do a whole group of people that were not known, did not have a great deal of background, and had a little bit of room for growth. And I thought that Mark did well with writing it that way, and I did my best to draw it that way.
I think you bring up a really excellent point, is that in some other people we've spoken to, that when you, like you said, with Captain America, there are, you know, some barriers on what you can and can't do with certain things. So to have that sort of creative freedom to maybe push things a little bit, or, you know, find your own voice, for you creatively, how important was that to be able to stretch out a little bit more?
Well, I think about that point I was beginning. I'm not sure that I think it was doing that book that made me realize what I just described. I didn't know it going in, but it became very clear to me that you could do stuff, and that there was a certain amount of fun to. Oh, I remembered little. I think a lot of times artists will enjoy little things that they've done, so that they had been through rough times before they all got together, and so that the Tom Thumb's laboratory was a mix of anything I could find to put in it, lots of duct tape and cracked screens and stuff like that. Which when he finally invented a mind changer, I wanted it to look as if he had taken an old hairdresser type dryer and re-rigged it, as opposed to that somehow he had all these resources. He was having to, you know, get stuff from junk shops and things. So.
I'm so glad you brought him up, because Tom Thumb to me is, I mean, I love comics, I love the different characters, but he was one of the first characters that I guess touched me emotionally, as silly as that sounds, but because he seemed like his heart was always in the right place, and he was always overlooked by people, and he just wanted so much to be part of the team and to help out as much as possible. And I always felt, you know, not bad for him, but just, come on, guys, like, give Tom a chance.
Well, I overlooked has a double meaning in his case, because of course he was only 3'6", and that meant a great deal to me to draw him, because dwarfism ran in my family.
Okay.
And so I had an aunt and a cousin, and the cousin's kids. They were all dwarves, and as opposed to midgets. And Tom Thumb was definitely a dwarf, and I could actually, you know, I knew how a dwarf walked and how that felt, and I think the proper term to use is little. People is what people prefer to be called. It's just that there's a distinction between dwarfism and what happens to a midget. A midget is, I don't think any of those terms are scientifically proper, but I knew, because of another person I know was a midget. He grew into his entire life, and by the time he was old, you would have thought him a rather odd-looking adult, because he had certain childlike qualities, but he had become taller and got taller and taller and taller. The original Tom Thumb, Barnum's Tom Thumb, Barnum's always afraid he would outgrow being a midget, because really just retarded growth that can continue their entire lives, whereas dwarves are, it's the way they're built and the way they're shaped and stuff. And so I enjoyed the physicalization of it, but also just the psychology of. My aunt would tell me wonderful stories about little things about being little that were had gotten to her. One time she was on a trip to, and I think this is pertinent in terms of Tom Thumb. She was on a trip to California, and her husband, who was normal sized, died while I was on the trip, and she had to make her way and she said, I'd always been treated as a little girl because I was little, and all of a sudden I had to be the age that I was, which was in her 20s at that time. And she had a daughter, and they had to send the daughter home on the train and have somebody look after her. And Ethel came home on the train, and she said she managed to get through it all without breaking down until she got to the train station and was supposed to call my mother and couldn't reach the phone. And things like that influenced the way I do it.
Right. No, you did an amazing job, and like I said, it's one of my favorite series of all time. And one thing that I forgot who I spoke to about it, but Tom's death, I thought was handled very nicely because they said he had cancer, but there was no need to show him dying. There was no need to show his death. All they had to say was this happened at this time, very matter of factly, like you'll see on the news. It didn't have to be an explosion or something gory or something that has to like sear into your brain. It's just matter of fact, this is life and this is what happened.
Yeah, well, I think the matter of fact things actually in some ways sear into our brains more than the other things are these huge incidents. But the tough thing about life is that people keep going away. And you get to my age and people have gone away. And I think that was very much the way Mark handled that was good. My only regret with that series is that I was dying by the time he got all of the people in. I did, I think, 2 issues with all the villains and all the heroes, and I literally was dying. I was up every night until about 4, and then getting back up, and after a couple of hours of sleep and doing it, because I've never been that fast. And I wish I had really put everything, I was really putting everything into penciling it. I was really feeling good about how it looked. And if I had it all to do over again, I would have gone into Mark and said, look, I can't keep up this pace, but I could do it in breakdown. Breakdown being, I'm sure everybody knows, but that you just don't put in shading or blacks. You do the storytelling and you lay it out with accuracy, but the inker does the finesse. But I didn't. I decided it was just time I needed a rest.
Yeah. Another project involving Jim Shooter, and it's something I'll always be grateful for him for, was starting Valiant Comics. Were you there at the ground floor, or had it been moving along a little bit and then you came in?
Oh, it had been moving along. They weren't doing. Jim had a sort of cadre of people who were Bob Layton and
Barry Windsor Smith.
Well, no, Barry came on later, I think. When they first started, they were doing a lot of license work. They were doing games. They were doing Mario Brothers and Zelda. And they had a deal with the that was WWF back then, but the WWE to do wrestling comics. And Jim had always intended to start a universe, but they were trying to get started that way. And I can't imagine Barry Smith doing any of those. So I don't know quite when Barry came into it, but he had said to me, whenever you want to, you can come on board. And I did a couple of wrestlers for them, and was I think I was starting to do with Zelda just about the time that they either lost the license or decided that they were not going to do any more licensing work. And I think I had one that I started one page and then got a call saying, don't do it. But I wasn't getting as much work from Marvel after Jim left. And so at some point, when he started doing stories, and yeah, well, no, that's not true. For a while, I was just doing fine. But he hadn't started doing stories yet. And then when he started doing stories, I thought I had worked for Marvel for a long time, and I thought it would be good nice to do something else. And called him up and expected that maybe he would give me something to draw, and he wanted me to write. And it's that same thing of him having seen the plays and that kind of stuff. And so he gave me a choice of I think it was 5 different books that he said, pick one of these. He said, we're really running short on writers, and why don't you look at them and see which one you'd like to do, which I thought was nice. And I picked Shadowman because it was the least developed of any of them. It had, I think, Steve Englehart had the original idea for Shadowman. But Steve was long gone by the time I got there. And I don't think he ever even was credited with writing any of it. I think the first, there had been 6 books, and I think maybe three, I can't remember, but 3, it was as if there had been 3 different writers and 3 or 4 different artists. And the last one, issue 6, is where I came on, but it was already drawn. And I don't think I think maybe Shooter took credit for the story, but I don't think I think it may have been a collective, and Ditko drew it. And that was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't meet him, of course, but I it was the closest I ever gotten to working with Ditko was that they turned it over to me to write the dialogue for the finished story. And so that's when I came on. But really, I started with the next one, writing it. And I felt, it was set in New Orleans, and I thought, and it was kind of vague. I thought, New Orleans, I love that, and it's clearly not quite working. And if I screw it up, I'll be in good company, and if I make it work, I'll look pretty good. so that was what I picked.
If you could have started it from issue 1, what changes would you have maybe made leading up to where you jumped on?
Well, I actually did change a bunch of that stuff because basically I rebooted it.
Right.
But I rebooted it in context that I had him. I think Master Dark kind of burned up his uniform, which looked a little bit like Dr. Denton's, blue Dr. Denton's for a while. And he wasn't really I didn't think he should have been a Lycra character. So I had him out of necessity switch to something else. And I thought he was much more became more of a kind of a motorcycle guy at night. And but the big thing was his origin had something to do with space aliens, that trying to tie it into the Valiant. I think they called it spider aliens. And when they had me do a Shadowman 0, I worked around that so that it had less to do with that, and that Master Dark had somehow tricked the aliens, or some way to get that out of the picture, because it really didn't help. It was one of those things that didn't help the book, because he's set among the voodoo of New Orleans, and the fact that there's outer space involved just didn't seem to be a good fit for him. So some of it I took care of, and I think that actually what we did with it eventually was kind of fun, and where I would have started it, because it was one of the things that happens with superheroes is that they gain powers, and it seems like a couple of days later they know how to use them. Whereas think about it, all of a sudden something strange happens to you and you have to interpret what's happening to my body. Why am I doing these? Why am I becoming a stranger, a different person at night? How do I deal with it? And so I would have him be able to do something one night through adrenaline, and then try to remanufacture that, and he couldn't find it again, and I thought that was fun. And I would have just done it that way from the first issue, because I think that's a fun thing for somebody to do, is say, what when most of writing and most fantasy is a matter of playing what if. And if is the key word, I think, in making up fiction anyway. And so what if I became a superhero? How would I feel? How would I act? So.
And being at, like you said before earlier, but at Valiant, kind of was clean slate, because these were sort of new characters that didn't have a ton of backstory, didn't have fans being like, no, he actually did this and this. Like, you could move around a little more creatively. Did that sort of help get the creative juices going as a writer, that you could do what you like? You didn't have to stay within certain things?
Yeah. Oh, yes, all of that. I didn't have to stay. And I was lucky, I think. Now, by the time I did the first story arc, Jim was gone.
Okay.
Which was one of the stranger things about Valiant, was that Jim's partners and Jim wanted to go two different directions. And there were more partners than there was Jim, and so they dominated. But Bob, when he took over, seemed to like what I was doing. He just let me alone, and pretty much. I don't think I very seldom, if ever, got told, do it this, or the only things that I was told a couple of times were, I was commanded to get him to New York somehow, so that Dr. Mirage could make his first appearance before his own comic. He could make an appearance in Shadowman, and I really resisted, because I had an arc in mind that didn't involve that at all. And they said, "Well, put that off for a while. He's a musician. You can have him get hired to do something." And I said, "Okay, I can do that." And then there was that crazy time when the collector's market was huge, and 6 weeks later they handed me this very handsome check, because it was the royalties of it being. I wish I could say it was because that the book was so good.
Yeah,
it had probably the best cover I've ever done. Shadowman clinging to the top of a yellow cab, but it really had to do with that it was collectible. Yeah. And then Steve Mazarski, who was the CEO, had been a rock and roll lawyer, and of the Allman Brothers, and Steve Tyler Aerosmith, yeah. And so we had to do Shadowman meets Aerosmith. Again, they picked Shadowman because he was a musician, and at least there would be some logic to that. And that was just crazy. That was nuts.
I remember that one very well, and just sort of being like, wait, what's going on here? But
yeah,
it kind of tied itself in a bit.
I did my best with it. Yeah, it was a cobbled together job, because a lot of the finalization of it, the inking, etc., only happened at the very last minute, because we couldn't get approvals. We just couldn't get them to approve the images that we'd drawn and the stories. And finally, Steve called the band personally rather than dealing with their people. Mm-hmm. And they said, what? Oh, no, we don't care. It's fine. We had been waiting because it was certainly on the back burner for any of their PR men to deal with this comic book, So nobody had asked them those things. I did a signing with them, which was crazy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I did a signing in Chicago it wasn't C2E2 then, it was just the Chicago Comic Con. And they had this room, and here was this big table with Aerosmith and with me at the end. And people coming in saying, who the hell is the guy at the end of the table? We don't know who he is. Except for one person that came in and didn't want their signature. They only wanted my signature. I thought that, I wish I got that person's. Oh, no. And a bodyguard that they had, this huge guy who couldn't figure out why I was there. So I'd get up and go to the bathroom and come back, and he'd kind of lift me off my feet saying, where are you going? I said, I'm the artist, remember? I'm sitting at the end of, oh, yeah. and they finally, this happened twice. And finally, Steven Tyler said, I'm tired of this. I want to go to the convention. And they said, you can't go to the convention. See, we don't have any security. So, but I don't think they'd gotten that far, actually. I think they'd gotten to Kant, and he was off. Wow. And then they said, the rest of the band, you guys, we all got to stick together. We all got to go to the convention together for security reasons. So everybody moved. And I didn't think they were talking about me. I was going to still sit there. Everybody said, no, you got to come too. You're part of the band now. And so we started up the stairs to the convention, and here's this guy that said, where are you going? And a light bulb went on, and I said, I'm the artist, remember? You're in the comic too. And he said, yeah. And all of a sudden, I was in the band as far as he was concerned. And he started bringing me Cokes the rest of the day and stuff. And then I had to call them Monday when I got back and said, you got to send me back the last page of this so I can stick this guy in, or I'm dead meat.
Well, I want to touch briefly, because you did do some work for DC as well. Mm-hmm. What was your experience with DC like? How different was it from maybe a Marvel experience and a Valiant experience? Because you hear from people DC was a little more corporate, a little more buttoned up than other places.
No, my experience with DC was unique because it was me going to Denny O'Neil, who was the editor. And Denny, of course, was already a legend. Mm-hmm. And saying, I didn't even know if Denny would know who I was. And of course he did. And he said, yeah, we'd love to have you. I think just where we don't have any openings in the monthly, why don't you just pitch me special projects? And they had this series that was called the Prestige series. Saying you worked on a Prestige series is almost as annoying as saying you were the co-creator of something, And I did these things. It was the Prestige series, but it was really kind of fun because I could pitch ideas, and got to do an Elseworlds, and I wanted to do one just kind of what I figured was a typical Batman story, and then I did one called It's Joker Time with the Joker had been undergoing therapy at Arkham Asylum, where they was forcing him to watch endless loops of daytime television, and eventually his mind became completely gone, and he escapes, of course, and is living on the street homeless, and is found by I called him Barry Dancer, but of course it was supposed to sound like Jerry Springer, and he became they put him on a reality TV show, and of course he eventually comes to himself and takes over the entire network. And I had great fun with it, but I think Denny liked it, but I think the rest of DC, it was just when DC was going very, very grim, and this was satire. So it was my version of Network. Right. So I don't know, but if you there are copies out there and get it, it's like it's Joker time, and I think you'll enjoy it.
I'll look that one up, but definitely. If, as sort of a two-part question, but as an artist and as a writer, are there any characters you would have liked to have worked on that you didn't get a chance to?
The Hulk,
Okay.
because I think he's a great character.
Mhm.
The Jekyll Hyde aspect of it is fun,
Mhm.
and he's just fun to draw. He's different from he ain't handsome, you know. So that's the one. I mean I worked him into some things, but I never got to draw his own comic.
Okay. And when you go to these conventions, what's the number one comic people bring up to you to have you?
Oh, West Coast Avengers #1. No
That's
question. Yeah.
Are there any books you worked on that you're kind of like, man, I just wish somebody would bring this book once for me to sign because you really enjoyed it, but you just never see it?
Yeah. Well, it's the a series called Armed and Dangerous
Mhm.
that I did for Valiant Acclaim, or Acclaim. I guess it was just Acclaim then, but I always think of it as Valiant / Acclaim. And I stopped doing Shadowman because they wanted to make a game. They were making a game out of it. Acclaim bought the company, and mistake they made, because they bought it when the numbers looked amazing, but if you were watching the numbers, you realized that there were already beginning to be fissures in that market. But for better or for worse, they bought it, and we're going to make a Shadowman game. And Shadowman in the book was a mixed race character, Creole, in as I was doing him and as he had been created, and they were wondering if I could make him into a full-fledged African American character, and I said that didn't seem possible without that seemed kind of creepy to me, and so I said, I will give you some way of killing off Jack, or getting him out of there, or he has a permanent injury or whatever, and you can reboot it with a new Shadowman. And actually, you're talking about things I would have changed. Somebody before I got on board, somebody from the future, they had a thing called Unity that was about issues 3 or 4 of Shadowman, and all the characters were involved. And a woman from the future told Jack that he was going to die in 1999. So I decided I would give him a nervous breakdown about that, because this was 1994, I think. And when I said I would do something with him, that he became obsessed with the idea of, could he even die before? Could he die before 1999? And I finally had him jump off of a tall building of the tallest building in New Orleans, which I had to make up because I don't think there was a tall enough building in New Orleans. But and I left him halfway down and said, "No, you can have him squashed or terribly injured, or I know how I know a way. I've built in a way that he can be rescued but still go away." And as near as I know, he's still halfway down. They didn't do anything with it. So, but I went from that to doing Armed and Dangerous. That was probably the favorite thing I've ever done. But not many people saw it because it was the print runs were getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the crisis began to happen and the collector's market began to fail. But it was set on the Upper West Side. It wasn't a superhero thing. It was set in Hell's Kitchen, where there was a gang called the Westies. There was the Irish Mafia. And so it was sort of My Sopranos, but long before the Sopranos. And I did that for 2 arcs and 1 special, and had great fun with it because I could. It was. I in Shadowman, I tried my best to work in real places, real events from my life. I think that's how you make the characters unique, is by going to reality with it. I don't mean you have to steep it in reality, but just the nature of an incident. So, for instance, the first issue of Armed and Dangerous, when I moved into my last apartment in New York on West 81st Street, I read in the New York Post that a severed head had been found in a dryer that was only 2 blocks away. And the New York Post was really pretty much a rag of a paper, but I bought it religiously for a couple of weeks just to see where is something about what happened with that. Nobody never knew anything about it. So the first issue of Armed and Dangerous was told the story of how that severed head got in the dryer. And, so I could just have fun with stuff like that, and put in a lot of just little details here and there that I think is a great fun to do in comic, just things that you see in the background, So at one time they had to hide out in a motel, and I had to go out to New Jersey to direct a play, and coming back, you'd always pass this motel which had a big sign that said, "Love thy neighbor here." And, so that was just one panel, but it was just something you could put in the background that made it more than just a generic motel. It was fun. And so people who can bring me that, because it's slowly, by the time I did the last arc, the print run was so small that I never even got any copies. I had to go find them and buy a few. And then I had one more arc that I was going to do. And I thought, I don't know if they're going to stay in business, but they're still paying me. And I was living overseas at the time. I had taken the advantage of that we were making good money. And I said, this isn't going to last. And I've always wanted to live overseas. I'm going to live overseas. So I was living in England. And by that time, Bob Layton was gone, and Fabian Tizia was the editor. And he called me and said, we're going to go out of business. But it won't happen for a while. I don't know exactly when, but clearly we're going to go under. And you're under contract, so do as much of this issue of this arc as you can, and as fast as you can, and we'll pay you for it. And that, which I thought was very decent of him. And I managed to get 3 issues done out of 4 before they pulled the plug on it, which those will never see the light of day. But
oh, really? So you have no control over those now? That those are just no.
No, I don't own them. They're out there in the ether somewhere.
Maybe
I actually got some of them back about 5 years ago. Somebody had them in a cardboard box in their garage for 20 years. But nobody knows who. The new Valiant claims they bought the rights to that as well. I don't think they really know whether they did or not, but you'd have to go through all this kind of legal stuff, and we'll see. Hopefully if it all works out, I just signed on to do a 10-page origin story for a Shadowman game. Nice. for the new Valiant. I hope they're around long enough for it to actually come out. We'll see.
Fingers crossed.
There's a lot of rumors about them, but the people I talked to said, no, we're fine. We're just retooling. So I hope that's true. Yeah, I'd like to see them stick around.
Yeah, I think so. And finally, Bob, where could fans find you, see what you're up to, get in touch with you on social media?
I'm terrible at it. There's Bob Hall Comic Artist, and I swear I'm going to start updating it more often. But they can find me on that Facebook.
Okay.
Well, and I'm Bob Hall. BobHall.com is my website.
Hey, welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that episode. I did. Did you? Michael, did you enjoy that episode?
It was amazing in my ears.
Good, good. No, as serious, Oren, as always, another home run.
Thank you.
I think you're trying to slowly but surely edge or Mike and I out, but that's okay.
They do call me, the star, the one and only. But no, honestly, it was a great talking to Bob. So many wonderful stories. The guy's had a historic career. Has a career in theater as well too, which is something we've heard with John Ostrander and a few other people, which is just a really interesting twist on, the two worlds kind of coming together with his art and with theater. So I think this was a exciting interview.
You're a storyteller in one format, you can be a storyteller in another format. And I always find, playwriting and play, execution, I guess, to be one of those great sort of hand-in-hand art forms with comics, actually. So that was great to hear. And I will, second the compliment, Oren. Another home run for the Oren only cadre out there. So everybody, keep on listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. We will have more Oren only episodes. We will have more episodes with all of us together, even one coming up. So we will see you soon.